Let's keep calm and mother on. Mothering is way too important to do alone and way too serious to be serious all the time. My name is Christy Thomas, and I am here shoulder to shoulder with you, mothering and enjoying life together. This is the podcast where you can focus on being mindful and taking a deep breath with me and learning new things so you can pause and savor the amazing life you already have. Now let's go. I love finding an amazing book written by someone that is curious and humble. And today's guest is Melinda Wenner Moyer, and she's a contributing editor at Scientific American magazine and a regular contributor to the New York Times, Washington Post, and other national magazines and newspapers. She's a faculty member in the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program at the NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Her first book, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes, was published in July 2021, and I am so excited to finally bring a conversation with her to you. I'm not going to explain anything. Let's just jump in. I told you in the introduction I wouldn't spoil the conversation because I am so excited to talk with this author. Welcome, Melinda. I'm so glad to chat.
Thank you so much, Christy. I'm so glad to be here.
So you are not a parenting expert. Let's start with that.
That is correct. I definitely am not. I don't know what I'm doing most of the time with my own children. So no, I'm not a parenting expert. I am a science journalist. Which means I've been writing about science and medicine for 15 years as a freelance journalist. So that's kind of how I consider myself. But as a science journalist, you can kind of like become, I dig into research on issues. And so that is how I guess I got to my book is I was like, you know what, I want to know what the research says on raising good human beings. And so then I just dug into it.
Well, yeah, you're invested because you have two human beings you're trying to raise.
Exactly. Yes. I have a 10-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. And and then like a few years ago, I feel like I was getting more and more frustrated and worried by the behavior I was seeing around me, like the bad behavior and the Me Too allegations coming to light. And I was and I was just like, what I realized what I care about more than anything else is that my kids grow up to be good people and not jerks. And I started looking into the research on it because I'm a nerd and that's what I do. And I realized like there's so much research on child development, on the development of character, on development of values. And like a lot of it was counterintuitive and surprising. And that's when I was like, you know what, maybe I want to write a book on this. Like this would feel like a good thing to do, an important thing to do, and in some way, like hopefully like help other parents who might be thinking the same thing and wondering how to raise good kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have both read your book and I've listened to your book. So I took it in two ways. And it is a really great book that answers questions that I know I've had and cried over with my girlfriends. Like, what do you do with this situation? Or how do we talk about racism? Or how do we talk about sexism or sexting and all these other things? There's a lot of bad behavior out there. And you're like, wow.
Yeah, I know. There's so much to think about and talk about. And So, I mean, certainly like that is the one tricky thing I think about the book is like it's trying to cover so much ground. And so there's chapters on things that are so different. And like each one has a totally different research base that I was looking into. And, with very different researchers studying the different things. But it was really interesting because I did see some like common themes popping back up over and over again in these different areas. And I thought that was really interesting.
I think overall, right? So you wanted to start this book because of all the bad behavior, right? That's where it came from. And then what was the first thing you wanted to dive into? What did you want to solve first?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I guess I have to start by saying some of the areas I had already delved into a little before I started writing the book. Like I did write about talking to kids about race for Slate a couple years earlier. So that one was like a huge one. I knew I really, really wanted to cover, and I wanted to dig into even more because I knew that the science on that was kind of surprising and a little bit challenges what a lot of white parents in particular think they should do. So that was a big one. But then I guess like once I started digging into the book and I thought about the things I didn't know anything about and the things I really wanted to learn about, I would say what I ended up tackling in that first chapter on selflessness, on raising generous kids and helpful kids, that felt like a really, really important part of this. Because when I was thinking like, what is like an asshole? What are the characteristics of an asshole? And what's the opposite of that? I was like, I think of selfishness as being like front and center with assholes. And so I want to know, like, what do we know about how to raise kids who aren't super selfish? And so that was a big important one.
And I think it was a great connection to everything else in the book, that really what it comes down to is, are we connected with other people? Can we consider the other, which is what assholes don't do, right? They don't consider the other at all, ever.
Yeah, it's just all about them all the time and what they want and what they need. Yeah, totally. So it really comes down to like connecting kids to that bigger community that they're in, whether it's like on a family level, you're part of a family or a community or the whole world, the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as our kids age, right, like their world gets bigger as they grow, and we can help them. We can scaffold those opportunities for them to be helpful.
Absolutely.
Starting with like the chores in our house and the helpful, unhelpful toddlers versus like teenagers that really can make whole movements happen. Right. It's amazing what our kids can do. Yeah.
Young people, I mean, they're the people who kind of change the world. They're so amazing at being able to think outside the box, at being willing to take risks that other people aren't willing to do. I mean, there's so many reasons that like teenagers are actually really, really important world changers.
They are. And I've got 2 teenagers right now, and it's really amazing to be in this space that I approach them with just such awe and curiosity that they're not like the teenagers, I don't know, that we see on TV, where we're just kind of dreading interacting with them. Like they get such a bad rap. And if we can just slow down and talk to them about what they're seeing and validate them, it's an interesting point of view. They have a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yes, they do.
So when we're talking about connecting to others and connecting to racism and talking about sexism, basically the big overall thing was to be more specific with our kids, isn't it? With how to not.
Yeah. Right. It's like, leaning into conversations that you might want to avoid. It was like a big thing that I kept coming up against. I just feel like there are so many, we are very well-meaning as parents. We want to protect our kids. We don't want to overwhelm them with like all the terrible things that happen in the world or all the issues that they are going to have to face. And this is really understandable. But at the same time, I think we overprotect and we lean away from conversations about issues that are actually, super complicated and nuanced, and that, our kids need to learn from us about, because like things like, sexism, racism, even like sex and pornography and relationships, these are things that like kids are getting messages from our culture, from the media. They're not always good messages. And so we need to be in there, also putting our voices in there as, to help them understand and make sense of what they're hearing and seeing and put things into context and sort of share our own worldview on the topic, because otherwise they're going to start making assumptions or conclusions that aren't really based in reality or just aren't very constructive. So that's a big thing. And I guess part of that, as you said, is so it's leaning into the things that we tend to avoid, but also, being specific and explicit sometimes in ways that we don't like to do. Like, I think we like to be very vague when we talk about race. We say like, everybody's the same on the inside, or, you should be friends with people no matter what they look like. And we kind of vaguely allude to race, but we aren't specific. And sometimes kids really don't get what we're trying to say. So being specific and being explicit and just like having conversations about things we feel nervous about. That's a really big part of the book.
Absolutely. In fact, this morning, just as I was reading a book with my son, we're reading this book called The Rickshaw Girl, and it's about a girl that lives in Bangladesh. And she's not allowed to pull the rickshaw, right? Like she can't provide any income for her family and she just wants to help. And so it was this great moment of talking about sexism with my son. And he's like, I've never heard of that word before. What do you mean? He's like, I know racism, but what's this other thing? I was like, oh, you're almost 9 and I haven't like used these words before. And that was a big moment.
Right. Yeah. I've had a lot of those moments where I'm like, wait, how have I not actually had this conversation with you yet? And I need to remedy that stat. But it is amazing. Like there's so many opportunities. I think once you start to look for them, opportunities to talk about issues, like when you're reading to your kids. Last night, I was reading an Amelia Bedelia book to my daughter, I feel like they're kind of old. I feel like I grew up, I don't know, with those books.
Yeah, and they're kind of outdated when you read them as a parent though, right? You're like, oh.
Yes. Exactly. And so like the opening scene was a dad coming home and he was tickling his daughter and she like really didn't like it and told him to stop, or it was unclear how much she liked it. But she said, please stop. And he wouldn't stop. Ooh. And my daughter was like, wait a minute, she didn't consent to that. And I was like, yes, let's have this conversation because we've talked about consent before. And we were like, and I was like, yes, it's true. If somebody's touching your body and you say, no, that person should stop. And we had this whole conversation just based on this like intro few paragraphs of this book, which books are so great for that kind of thing. Books, TV shows for like, press pause and let's talk about this for a minute,
Huge. And it's constructive for things like this, but also for people that don't live in diverse communities. When we want to talk about racism as white parents, we're not always showing diversity in a positive way and showing like joy of the Black experience.
Yes.
Because the news often shows trauma of the Black experience.
Right. That's very, very true. And I think, there's so many great books that can help, introduce our kids to these ideas and also give us language and the frameworks to try to talk about them if we're not sure how. I think, I rely on books a lot to help me as a parent to get into discussing different issues. We also have books for like body parts and puberty and, all those things that like, it's like you don't sometimes know where to start. And sometimes buying books and reading them to your kids is a great way in.
Absolutely. And the public library is a great resource for all those books too, if you're not sure if it's like the quality of book you want to have in your house. So.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. We love our library and it's so nice to feel like you can just check out some books. And if you don't like them, that's okay. Cause you can return them,
Exactly. Huge.
It just feels, yeah.
So when parents are talking about, let's say with racism, cause it's a big topic in the last year with the pandemic or parallel to the pandemic with George Floyd. And I live in Georgia. So there was Ahmaud Arbery that was pretty close by. So how are we talking about kids with racism or talking about it ourselves? Did you have to do your own work before you could talk about racism with your kids?
I did do definitely some work because I'll give you I'll tell you the little anecdote that sort of leads up to when I realized like I need to do some work on this myself. During the pandemic, my kids signed up to do like an online research study with for a social psychologist that I actually had met with before and who's cited in my book. And she was doing some research. And I actually didn't know what the study was going to be about. All I knew is she was a social psychologist who kind of studies how children understand groups and different, and relate to different kinds of groups of people. So I'm watching her so she gets her iPad and it's a thing that she's doing by herself. And I was like, and I said, okay, just be honest and answer these questions however you feel is right. There's no wrong answer. But I kind of stood behind her and I was watching. And it turned out that this study was understanding basically how kids develop racial prejudice and like how different kids think about race. And so they showed pictures of different kids of different skin colors, basically, and said, if you were on the playground, which child would you like to play with? And I was petrified that she was going to, only choose other white kids because we're white. And I was very happy that, she did choose a diverse group, because they asked the question over and over again with different pictures. So sometimes she chose white kids, sometimes she chose black kids, sometimes she chose brown kids. And I was very happy about that. But then the last question they asked her was, who do you think your parents would want you to play with on the playground? And she chose white kids every time. And I was beside myself. I was like, what does that mean? What does she think? And I didn't engage with her on it because I didn't want her to think that she had done something wrong. I didn't want her to feel like worried or ashamed that she'd upset me. So I actually didn't talk to her about this. I probably could bring it up now. It's been so long, and maybe bring it up in a different way. But I remember just thinking, gosh, there's some reason that my daughter thinks that I would prefer her to hang out with white kids. And what is that reflecting? Am I behaving in a way as a parent? Am I sending this message somehow that I only like white people? And, I really led to some introspection. And that's when I started getting books from the library on race and on raising kids as white parents, and on just understanding racism and understanding the implicit kind of biases that we have. And I just started reading, and I was like, I need to educate myself and understand what my biases are that I might not be aware of, and how I might be communicating these to my kids. And I really learned a lot, and I'm still reading. I'm actually
absolutely.
I feel like it's an ongoing journey and ongoing growth. But yes, I did do that. And I think it's really helped me figure out, how to talk about some of these things with my kids, because it is really hard as a white person to talk about race.
Very hard as a white person to talk about race. And what you said in your book was that we learned that when kids notice race, they invent ways to explain what's happening. And they invent their stories, right? We're all telling ourselves stories all the time. But unless we actually stop and interrupt their thoughts and talk about it, that they're developing racism without us really knowing what's happening.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. And I'll try to explain that a little bit, because it does seem like, well, why would that happen? Why would kids develop racist ideas without, hearing people say racist things, or, because it is kind of counterintuitive. This is, again, one of the areas of research I found really interesting, because it really does push against our
if we work in not seeing skin tone and just treating people as humans, why would this happen if they only see me treating people kindly?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, and this is what a lot of white parents do. They raise their kids in what's called a colorblind way. They think okay, if I don't talk about race, if I don't make a big deal out of it, then my kids won't make a big deal out of it. They won't notice that different skin colors, and they won't treat people differently based on their skin color. And that totally makes sense on some level. But the problem is, as you were saying, kids are trying to figure out why the world looks the way it does. They're trying to figure out what social categories matter. So they're basically little detectives for a lot of their youth, where they're just making a lot of observations and just trying to figure things out. Yeah. And they see very clearly that there's a racial hierarchy in our society. They see that white people tend to have more power, more money, than people of color. And they see that in their schools. I mean, a lot of schools, if you think of the gifted and talented programs, for instance, are mostly white. And they also see that, people tend to self-segregate often by race, that neighborhoods are segregated by race, that schools are segregated by race. So they very quickly see, okay, race is important.
Yep.
And they also see this hierarchy. And when nobody comes in, when the parents don't come in and say, let me explain why this hierarchy exists, let me explain why white people have more power, it's because of racism. When we don't provide that context, then they're going to come to their own conclusion. And the simplest conclusion is, I guess white people are just better or smarter or more powerful in some innate way. And this is how they come to this idea that, basically they come to racist conclusions. And it's understandable, because it is the most simple conclusion you can make when you look at the picture that we have in front of us.
Kids are meaning-making machines, and they're just going to find the simplest answer.
Right. Exactly. And it's not because, they're terrible kids or you're terrible parents. It's because this is what the world looks like. And so this is the simplest way for them to interpret what it looks like. So that's why it's so important for us to talk about racism. And also because they, as I said, they notice race is important. And then they also notice that we don't talk about it. And there's something in that disconnect too, that becomes very important for kids, where they're like, okay, clearly this is an important thing. No one wants to talk about it. It must be like bad in some way. It must be taboo. Like maybe race is bad. And especially when we sometimes like inadvertently, like when our kids say something about race in public and then we shush them or we say like, don't say that, that's not nice. That just feeds that. And they think, gosh, nobody, this must be one of those secret important things that nobody wants to talk about, but it's actually hugely important. And so that like adds to it. And so it just becomes kind of this like vicious cycle where, kids feel like they can't talk about it, but they've got all the wrong ideas about it. And they also just start to associate like race and skin color with badness. And it's just.
Different accents or different things that there's a lot of ways it shows up in comments or in jokes that you're like, wait a second. Where did that come from? We don't talk like that in our house. And then I have to back the train up and be like, okay, let's not shy away from these conversations. But they're uncomfortable to have.
They're so uncomfortable. I mean, they're still very uncomfortable for me. And even just like talking about race on a podcast is uncomfortable because like, I feel like I've been socialized my whole life to not talk about race, and I think many of us have.
Absolutely.
Especially for white, that's not usually true in families of color, but yeah, when you're white, it's like, don't talk about this. And so it's really hard to get over that hurdle. And I mean, it does get easier. Like it is every time I talk to my kids, it gets a little easier, but I still, hear myself saying things and I'm like, that is not coming out right. And, and often I have to go back to my kids and say like, I think I explained this concept, maybe not in the best way. Can I talk about it with you again and like revisit it, because we're going to make mistakes when we're trying to talk about these really difficult topics.
Absolutely. And
that's okay.
It's important, right? Like this is just an opportunity, and it's important to know that our kids are not too young to have these conversations, that we can have these conversations from the time they're preschoolers playing with other preschoolers for the first time at a city park, or when my kids go off to college in a couple of years. Like these conversations are still going to keep happening. I mean, in the last year, I've had these conversations with my own parents, right? Like these conversations don't end just because our kids reach a magic age of 18.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think sometimes we think of things as parents as like, we need to have like one talk with our kids about an issue, like especially with sex. We have the birds and the bees talk, and that's the one time we talk about it. But yeah, with all of these things, these should be like ongoing conversations. And that in a way that takes the pressure off, because it means like if you kind of don't make a lot of sense the first time you try to talk about an issue, I think like the first time I tried to explain Black Lives Matter, I did not do a great job of it. But then like we've talked about it like 30 more times since then. And so I've had more opportunities to kind of, figure out how to talk about it. And so thinking of it that way as like an ongoing conversation in a way makes it a little easier, I think.
I think so too. And I think it helps when we have opportunities to see the news or to read good books or to watch great programs or talk about elections. There's a lot of reasons that we can keep the conversation going that are inside our house. So maybe they'll feel less scary to talk about because it doesn't directly involve our own kids. Yeah. Because initially when you want to have these conversations, right, you want to make sure that your kids aren't defensive about it or shamed. Like it's a gentle conversation.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I think that is something really important to keep in mind. And that's true even if like your way into the conversation is that your kid said something that's kind of racist.
Yeah.
I think it's because our initial response in our head and heart is like, oh my gosh, my kid just said something racist. This is horrible. I'm so upset. But often our kids don't really know what they're saying. They don't understand all the baggage that's associated with what they said. And so trying to not sort of shame them for saying things and instead, to kind of say, like, even ask them questions like, well, why do you say that? Or where did you hear that? Or what do you mean by that? And then trying to get into it in a sort of a non-shaming way, but also communicating like, well, actually, ultimately that's not a very nice thing to say. And here's why. But yeah, trying to trying to make the conversation something that your kids don't feel really uncomfortable in, or as you said, defensive about, is really, really helpful too. Yeah.
Yeah. We need to approach these conversations with all these hard parts of parenting with just compassion for both ourselves and them. That's our biggest goal here. If you want to not have an asshole, compassion is a key part.
It's so true, because they're learning from us, like whatever we're modeling, they're learning from. And so if we are showing them compassion, then they're going to be more likely to show other people compassion. I mean, it's just, they learn from what we do more than what we say sometimes. And so, yeah, that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And another kind of theme of the book is like model the behavior you want to see in your kids, because they learn from you.
And so now that you've written a parenting book, are you like an expert every day in your house?
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say it took a really long time for me to even feel like I saw any changes in myself after I read all this research. I talked to so many researchers and experts and read all sorts of studies and learned all sorts of things. And I found it was, really, really slow to see changes. And I think parenting is very reactive. It's very emotional. Very. And our kids can push our buttons in so many ways. And so we're not often responding rationally. We're responding with whatever like emotional part of us is kind of being, I don't know, the trigger is not the right word, but sort of like triggered.
Yeah.
And so I found like I had to figure out how to access like that rational part of my brain that kind of, knew maybe a more constructive way of handling something than I was handling it. And that took a long time. And I think it took a lot of practice. But I still all the time find myself doing something. And, after the fact, I'm like, wow, that is kind of like directly contradicts what I wrote in my book. I did not handle that as well as I should have. And, I find that it's more, I'm more often able to use the techniques that I talk about in the strategies than I used to, for sure, but it's not like 100% by any means. And I think that that's something that we all have to keep in mind. Like there's no perfect parent. And even, I have friends who are child psychologists and they know so much and they spend their whole day steeped in the world of like child development and child psychology. Yep. And they tell me like they don't know what they're doing half the time and they're making mistakes all the time and they're yelling at their kids. So I think that's a really, really important thing. And I hope an important message for my book is like, it's hard for everybody. And even when like a constructive way to handle a situation, that doesn't mean you can always do it. And that's okay, because I think those mistakes too are constructive. We can use mistakes as like learning opportunities with our kids. I am often apologizing to my kids saying, I don't think I handled that very well. What do you think I could have done to calm myself down better? Or how do you think I could have handled that better? And we have these conversations about like, my own mistakes and the things that I could improve upon. And I feel like that's kind of normalizing to my kids that it's okay to make mistakes even when you're grown up, and it's good to apologize, and it's good to take responsibility for your actions, and like nobody's perfect. And I think all those are really good messages for kids too.
Absolutely. I think the biggest takeaway, right, is the trust the process of growth. That if we want our kids to be kind, compassionate, connected adults, we need to keep trying that ourselves, even when it's hard.
Yep, absolutely. And it is hard.
Very hard, isn't it? Especially with the last 18 months. Like you wrote this book when your kids were at home with you, right?
Well, actually,
kind of, or was it mostly done?
It was. So this is actually pretty amazing. Yeah. I finished the first draft of the book on March 1st, 2020.
Oh my goodness.
So it was right under the wire. And honestly, like, I don't know what I would have done if it had been due like March 1st, 2021 or something. Like, I don't know. I mean, it was just very lucky. And then the book ended up getting held for a long time because they didn't want to put it out during the pandemic. I mean, ultimately it did come out during the pandemic, but they didn't want to have it come out.
Things we didn't know. Yeah.
I know, right? We thought it would be over by July 2021. But it's not. But yeah, so I did write I did write it, although I did editing during the pandemic, but it was mostly done before the pandemic.
Yeah. And now we're just kind of in the state of being languished and tired and trying to carry on. So that was my favorite. Your epilogue of the book wrapped it up so nicely to just keep trying to just show up with kindness, mostly for yourself, so that you can show up for your kids that way with compassion, and to not shy away from the hard conversations. We have to keep having them.
Yes, we do have to keep having them. Unfortunately, but they do get easier with time. I found like they do slowly get easier. And now it doesn't feel like as much of I feel like it used to be, I felt like I was having a heart attack every time I would try to talk about race with my kids, but now it's a little bit easier. Yeah.
And now I feel like the more conversations we have like this, the more my kids can predict what I'm going to say, especially as my teens, that they interrupt me and they're like, okay, I understand. And then they fill in the blanks for me. And I was like, okay, at least it's sinking in. If I don't have to say it again, they can tell me what they think I'm going to say. And then I can correct. It's fun to see.
That's fantastic. I bet that is really fun to see. Yeah. Yeah. And my kids love calling out things that they think are like sexist or racist now. And that's great, because then when they call it out, it can lead to another conversation about it. But yeah, like last night when my daughter was like, she didn't consent to being tickled. And I was like, yes, let's talk about that some more. And like, but she pointed it out, she noticed it.
That is fantastic. I'm so glad you give her the space to have that conversation with you. I don't know if a lot of us that are parents right now grew up with that space to push back on those ideas, to comment that the book was wrong.
Yeah.
I want to give you credit.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, you're right though. I didn't have these kinds of conversations growing up, I don't think. I mean, and it's no fault of my parents. I think it was like the culture was different, I mean, it's just what you talked about at home was not what you can talk about now, I think, in a lot of ways. Yeah, it's a different world.
Yeah.
Which is
and I think, you know what, we're going to end. I think it's going to be a world with a lot of hope, right? Because our kids can keep having this hard conversations, at least with us at home. And so maybe when they go out, they'll have practiced how to use their shaky voices and ask the hard questions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We're making it easier for them to continue to have these conversations with their friends, with their, teachers, with whoever they want. But because we're helping to normalize talking about these things at home, it's going to make it so much easier for them in the future. Yeah.
Well, thank you for writing this book. I'm glad you dove into science to look into parenting. Not most of us don't have the access to the journals or to understand like what they say. So it's interesting to have you dive into the actual research, and like, because it's more cut and dry and kind of boring. Because parenting is so emotional. So when we start to think about it, we get spun up fast. So thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure. I mean, research is like, that's my thing. And that's my way into figuring out the world, is always through science and research. So it was fun to apply that to parenting.
So how are you taking care of yourself right now? Every episode we end with a self-care task and a family fun idea. How are you tending to yourself?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I'm doing a lot more of now than certainly like I was 2 years ago. I take a lot of walks just on my road. When my kids are at school, like almost every day, I try to walk for an hour and listen to an audiobook. And I'm otherwise really bad about going outside. I will just sit in front of my computer all day. But now, like, I need it. I've gotten used to it and I love it. And it feels just really nice to be out. And I also am reading a lot of fiction, which I didn't like used to do a whole lot. And I just find it's a really lovely escape. So every night before I go to bed, I read for at least like 45 minutes, and it's often like mysteries or like thrillers. I don't know. I love them, but it's like another escape. So those are two
Do you
big
have a
ones.
book that you finished that you just have to share?
Yes. So I just finished an awesome book, and it's also like a really feel-good book. It's called The Authenticity Project by Clare Pooley. And it is just a lovely story of like being kind and playing it forward and just being authentic. It's a lovely book. So I highly recommend that one.
Did you read it or did you listen to that one?
I read this one because I was traveling and I read it on the airplane. I was traveling cross country. Yes. So that was a couple weeks ago. It's really, really good. And a quick read too. It doesn't take too long. That's
fantastic. So how are you having fun as a family together? How are you connecting?
So one thing we have just come up with as a family, and I have to say we haven't actually done this yet, but we're going to start very soon. We decided, because we aren't going out a lot, that we're going to have like a theme like a country that's a theme for every weekend, and we're going to cook food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or at least breakfast and dinner. That's like, what that country's cuisine is. Because I love cooking different ethnic foods. I love cooking Indian food and Thai food, but I haven't been doing it a lot, especially with the kids home, and they haven't been exposed to a lot. But we recently got sushi, and they loved it. And we were like, okay, maybe they're old enough where we can start introducing more flavors, and they're getting a little more adventurous. So I feel like this is a really good way to like be able to talk about, history and stuff too, and like geography, but also have fun and cook together and introduce the kids to these different cuisines. So that is our new like fall idea that we're going to be trying out.
That is so much fun. I can't wait to see what recipes you try out. I hope you put them on like Instagram and share them when you try it. That's a great idea. That one of the things we did during the pandemic was there's this subscription box called Yum Yum Box, and they send you candies and junk food from around the world. And every month it's a different country, and they give you like a magazine with cultural facts. And
that's super cool.
And so that's been super fun because one, like we get to try like food that is interesting, like salty pineapple gummies from Thailand that we wouldn't have access to. But also like there's pictures and facts we can talk about, and we can figure out why their flavors are flavored this way when we start to dig in.
Awesome. That is so cool. I'm going to look that up and perhaps subscribe, because that sounds really fun.
Yeah, it's fun to share with our kids in our own home, right? Like I think I love that you're doing it at home, because it's a little bit safer to say that you don't like that, or
right.
Like we have to have all those conversations about trying things that are outside of our norm.
I know. And yes, and they're going to be picky, and I'm sure they're not going to eat half the things I make, and my husband also loves to cook, so he will also be participating, but like, that's the way it goes. It's okay.
Right. But if we were in a restaurant, I'd probably walk away thinking my kid is an asshole when they didn't, when they said something rude about the food in front of people that love the food. So thanks for another opportunity to like practice this, because there's so much. It's hard work being human.
It is very hard, and especially being a parent. Yeah.
Raising these kids is an interesting adventure. Well, thank you so much. Where can people find you best online?
My website is like a one-stop shop. It's melindawennermoyer.com. Okay. And there's purchase links for the book. And also you can sign up for my newsletter. I have a newsletter where I'm answering parent questions about challenging kid behavior. And also my Instagram, Twitter, Facebook pages are linked to on there too. So you can basically find everything about me there.
And your newsletters come out like every Saturday morning, I think, right?
They used to.
Okay.
Now they're coming out Tuesdays.
Okay.
But actually, and I'm going to be making an announcement next week, and there's going to be more content coming.
Oh, cool.
More
exciting.
Stuff. So, yeah.
How exciting. I look forward to your emails. So I'm glad.
Okay.
I'm glad you send them. So I can't wait to see what you do.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for being on. And I hope that you keep calm and mother on, because motherhood is too important to do alone, and we need each other. So thanks.
Yes, do. Thank you, Christy. This was awesome. This was so fun.